Mark, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Well, my name's Mark Solms. I'm a neuropsychologist and a psychoanalyst, and I've spent my working years sort of exploring the intermediate area between those two fields.
Cool. So today's topic was consciousness and the brain. So could you tell me, what is your position on that? Are you a physicalist, materialist, eliminativist, dualist? And what do you think the connections are between the consciousness and the brain?
Well, to answer the metaphysical question first, I'm a physicalist in the sense of dual aspect monist. If that sounds like a contradiction to you, I'm happy to explain, but I'm a monist, but a dual aspect monist. For me, physicalism is not the same as materialism, but I don't think that sets me apart from many people. In line with that metaphysical position, I think that the study of subjective experience is just a different observational perspective on the same part of nature as we study when we study this bodily organ called the brain. It's the same thing looked at from two different points of view. What is interesting, if you hold that position, if you hold the position that is that subjective experience and the physical organ of the brain are just two different aspects of one and the same thing, the interesting question becomes, well, then what is the underlying thing? What is the ontological nature of the thing that we can observe in these two different aspects? And that's where, when I say I'm a physicalist but not a materialist, that's where that comes in. I think that we need an account, a natural scientific account of the underlying unifying thing that explains both psychological subjective phenomena and physiological objective phenomena. And there, I think the language that we must use is what is an abstract inferential language. In other words, it's not the language of observable physical matter, nor the language of observable subjective experience, but rather something in the nature of a set of abstract inferences, laws, if you will, ultimately is what we're aspiring to, that provides a monistic explanation for both sets of phenomena, one explanation that accounts for both. And in most recent years, I've been using the free energy principle as a framework within which I'm trying to do that.
So a few questions are, what is the free energy principle?
The free energy principle ultimately, historically, derives from thermodynamics. But in more recent years, by which I mean since the introduction of the concept of information into physics, in other words, since Shannon in the mid-20th century.
Claude Shannon?
Claude Shannon, yes. So the original thermodynamic notion of free energy has now been transformed into an informational free energy. And the main figure who has developed that way of thinking is Carl Friston at University College London. So the free energy principle is a principle which basically boils down to the idea that the underlying mental apparatus, if you will, the thing that unifies both brain and mind, that it is functioning according to a principle of trying to minimize free energy in the informational sense, which is variational free energy, which is just to say that that the mental instrument or apparatus is trying to predict how to meet its needs in the world, and to the extent that its predictions are efficient in terms of trying to maintain its existence, to that extent, the informational energy is bound. In other words, it's doing effective work. To the extent that it's not, to that extent, the energy is free. In other words, it's a sort of average prediction error or average surprisal, as they call it, which, in practical terms, boils down to bad predictions as to how to meet my needs in the world so as to continue to exist.
Gotcha. And you said you're a dual aspect monist.
Yes.
That does sound like a contradiction because it seems like there's two fundamental aspects to monism. Are you saying that matter and mind are both made of something else that's more fundamental, and that's the monist thing?
Yes, I think that matter is an appearance and mind is an appearance. In other words, these are both phenomena. Matter is just something that you touch, something that you see. But in physics today, matter is no longer a fundamental element of the universe. Matter is a state of more basic energetics. And that we've known since Einstein. The very famous equation E equals mc squared is saying, that m fits into the equation and is reducible to other elements. So it's not a radical position one of the funny things about metaphysics and philosophy of mind, perhaps in general, the approach to the mind-body problem in particular, is that most people toying in that area haven't kept up with what's going on in physics, where the concept of the matter side of the mind-matter equation has really changed quite dramatically. So it's not an unusual position in physics to say that matter is not a fundamental property. Matter is further reducible to more elementary factors.
Well, I
So,
definitely agree with that. I think quantum fields are probably the most fundamental thing. But why think that consciousness has any significance as a equivalent fundamental property as opposed to just an emergent phenomenon in the universe like everything else we see, like stars,
well,
planets,
yes.
hearts?
Let me be clear first of all that I'm not saying that consciousness is a fundamental property. I'm saying it's an appearance of some. It's a way in which a more fundamental property manifests. I think that the crucial question is, why does this thing, the mental instrument, this monistic thing, which for want of a better word, I'm calling mental instrument or mental apparatus. In other words, the thing which underlies and explains the behavior of both brain and mind. Why does it need a mental aspect? In other words, why is it? What is it? What is the purpose of it having a subjective experience? Presumably not everything has a subjective experience. That's a panpsychist position, which is rather different from my own. So why do some things, but not all things, have a subjective dimension at all? What is the causal? What is the contribution made by? How does it alter the functioning of the apparatus that it is able to register its own states subjectively? And I think that's the big question. What is the functional contribution of sentient being, assuming that not everything has sentient being?
Right. So my question is more not specifically that it's the most fundamental, but in the hierarchy of things that we know that exist, quantum fields, physics, chemistry, biology, brains, where should we place consciousness on that hierarchy? Should we place it at the fundamental-ish level, like the quantum fields and the physics? Or because I'm a physicalist materialist, so I think that it should go after brains. I think in the hierarchy of existence of things, consciousness follows the existence of biology and brains, and it's an emergent property from those two things, as opposed to it being an emergent property from something in the fundamental nature of reality, like quantum fields. And I think that seems to be a more plausible view. So why should we move consciousness down the hierarchy level to more of the bottom, like the quantum fields level, as opposed to thinking it's just an emergent thing from brains?
Well, I don't think that it's as fundamental as quantum fields by any means. I think that before you can have consciousness, you need a self-organizing system. Self-organizing systems are physical systems which emerge even before biological systems. So, for example, a crystal is a self-organizing system of a very uninteresting kind. Living things, unicellular organisms, or self-organizing systems, I very much doubt if they're conscious. But now we've reached the level of complex dynamical self-organizing systems. That's what living things are. The question then becomes, at a certain point in the evolution of living things, there starts to be something that it is like to be a living thing. In other words, living things start to register their own states. So you can see I've gone very far from the Big Bang through, to the emergence of our solar system, to the evolution of our planet, to a point that living things start to appear on it, and then some distance down that line, those living things start to become sentient. So it's by no means a fundamental property. What I'm saying is, in line with my metaphysical position, is that we have to be able to explain how and why sentience arises in terms of its ingredients that precede it. So, it's in that sense that I say I'm a physicalist, and as I've just alluded to, I start with concepts like self-organizing systems, which precede living things, which precede living conscious things. And from there, we build up an explanation as to why do they eventually become aware of their own states.
So if you agree that consciousness comes from self-organizing physical systems like brains or whatever, why do we need to be anything more than a materialist? Why think that there is another aspect to reality at all?
Okay, well, sorry, I should have picked up on that point that you made a moment ago. I do not think that brains precede, or at least brains of the kind that are capable of consciousness, which is not all brains necessarily. And I'll gladly go into, what are the minimal anatomical and physiological properties of brains that are capable of sentience. But once we reach the evolution of brains that are sentient, those brains are on the same ontological level as the sentience is. In other words, the subjective experience of being that brain is a parallel dual manifestation of the brain. It's the subjective perspective upon that brain, which can be perceived as an object from the outside. So the brain does not produce the mind. The brain is one way of perceiving this thing, which can also be perceived as a subjective being. So they are on a parallel, equivalent ontological level for me. Mind does not emerge from brain. This goes back to the question of the difference between physicalism and materialism. To me, the material object of the brain is the external manifestation of something which manifests internally, subjectively to itself as sentient being. And that's where the question arises, well, what are the two of them both then reducible to? And I'm saying a physical account in the sense of physics, not in the sense of material biological organs, but rather in the sense of what in physical science, what laws can we deploy to explain the behavior of both of its subjective and its objective manifestations. And that's where I'm drawing upon the free energy principle, which is a derivation from ultimately, I said thermodynamics, but more interestingly, from the concept of self-organizing systems, which was introduced by Ashby shortly after Shannon introduced the concept of information into physics. Ashby developed the concept of self-organizing systems. Nothing controversial about it. There's no question but that self-organizing systems spontaneously arise in the universe, and their modus operandi is to continue existing as systems, which is why they ultimately become living things, which have that same modus operandi. The whole law of natural selection is that, whatever it is that keeps the organism or the species going is what ends up being selected as the thing that then becomes the fundamental properties of that of the next generation and the next generation. Is because whatever succeeded in keeping the system in existence is what gets selected. Now, that precedes life. It precedes natural selection. Natural selection is a biological excrescence of a principle, a more fundamental physical principle, and that's the principle that William Ross Ashby introduced when he developed the concept of self-organizing systems. So I hope I'm being clear that there's, for me, the thing from which both emerge, if I'm going to use the term emergence, both brain and mind emerge from self-organizing systems with a certain level of dynamical complexity.
So why do we need to posit that mind is something separate than just a physical system? Why say that why do we have that need as opposed to just going with classical hardcore materialism that says everything is material? Why should we think that mind is anything more than that?
Well, I think that's just another way of posing the question that I myself posed a few minutes ago when I said, I think the interesting question is, why do certain self-organizing systems become sentient? In other words, what is added by the awareness of your own states? So to cut to the chase there, I think that the fundamental transitional point between reflex organisms, in other words, organisms that function entirely monotonously according to naturally selected responses. The transition from that to sentient organisms is precisely that they can transcend reflex. In other words, they have the possibility of choice. They have the possibility of doing something of their own volition. And something has to guide that. What guides it? In other words, if you transcend reflex, which means that you can do something that will underwrite your survival in unpredicted environments. If you're in a novel situation for which your reflexes do not prepare you, how can you survive in such a situation? The adaptive advantage of consciousness is that it underwrites the choices. As I said, there has to be a value system. There has to be something that determines what's a good choice and what's a bad choice. Prior to the emergence of sentience, a good choice means you survive. A bad choice means you die. It's a bit late after you've died to learn it was a bad choice. So feeling, and I emphasize the word feeling because I think that's the most elemental form of consciousness. It is simple feeling. There's a goodness or a badness, valence. So one of the most fundamental properties of feeling. And a positive feeling, in other words, a pleasurable feeling, or a negative feeling, an unpleasurable feeling, is the way in which the organism becomes aware of whether the choices it's made are good or bad for it. In other words, they are before it's too late. You can feel this is going badly for me. In other words, I'm moving out of my viable bounds. Or you can feel this is going well for me. In other words, I'm moving back towards my viable bounds. It predicts your demise or your survival before the final catastrophe hits you. So I think that that's what feeling adds. It enables the system to make choices in unpredicted, novel environments, which underwrite its continued existence, which is why this then gets selected in, gets conserved by natural selection. This
So
is
just
an
to clarify,
enormous advantage.
are you talking like free will, like non-deterministic choices kind of a thing?
Yes, probabilistic, but so free will, not in any radical sense of the word, but yes, that there's not a predetermined choice, which is what reflex is. In other words, no choice. When the creature is faced with this stimulus, it responds in X way. When it's faced with that stimulus, it responds in Y way. That's always the case. The adaptive advantage is to be able to, if neither X nor Y succeeds, then what do? You don't have reflex Z. What you do is you suck it and see. You try this, but you try that, and the feeling tells you things are going better or worse for me. Let me translate this into all of this abstraction into a concrete example. Breathing is a reflex. We're breathing all the time by reflex. What is breathing for? It's for maintaining your blood gas balance. principally for keeping a sufficient oxygen supply in your blood. So we have a reflex, you just reflex without any intentionality involved. Your intercostal muscles are expanding your diaphragm at a certain rate, and that keeps the oxygen supply that you need. And so, you carry on living. Now you find yourself in an unpredicted and novel environment that reflex doesn't prepare you for. Let's say you're in a carbon dioxide filled room. In other words, the breathing in is not going to get you the normal amount of oxygen. You've never been in a burning building before, let alone this particular one. So you don't know what to do. You have no preparedness for it. So you feel air hunger. You feel suffocation alarm. That means this is not working. I'm not getting the oxygen I need. So you move upstairs. You don't know if upstairs is better or worse. You find that the feeling gets worse. In other words, the oxygen level is lower. It feels worse to you. So you move downstairs. There you find the feeling gets better. There's a relief. That means that the oxygen supply is better there. The feeling tells you whether you're making a good or a bad choice, and it guides your behavior. And that's the function of feeling. It enables the organism to survive in unpredicted environments. And to come back to the question that we're addressing, why does feeling exist at all? In other words, why does consciousness exist at all? You're saying, why can't we simply describe it in purely material terms? In other words, describe it in terms of the function of the organism as observed from the outside. Why does the organism have to be able to experience its state from the inside? That's the question I've answered. It contributes something causally to the actions, to the behavior of the system, which results in the system's survival. And I think that's the dawn of consciousness. That's what, because consciousness adds this enormous consciousness in the really rudimentary sense of raw feeling, that adds this enormous adaptive advantage and therefore gets selected in. And you can see, I don't think there's anything spooky about it. It's like any other biological thing. It evolved because it enhances survival and reproductive success.
So what about your view is adding something that's greater than the consensus view in neurology, psychology, cognitive science, that literally consciousness is nothing more than the physical processes in the brain? The identitarianism, I think, is what it's called, where consciousness is identical to the physical processes in the brain. There's nothing more than physical processes. Why do we need to posit this consciousness thing at all? It seems kind of redundant.
Well, first of all, I'm not so sure that you're correct to describe that as a consensus view, because if it was a consensus view, then I would hold it. There are some of us who don't hold that view. Some of us do not believe, some of us neuroscientists do not believe that consciousness doesn't add anything. That you could just, I mean, this philosophical zombie idea, that you could have an organism which in every respect from the outside is the same as you and me, and yet there's nothing going on the inside. I don't believe that. I think there is something going on in the inside if you're built like us. And the question is, what is that something going on in the inside adding? And I think I've just answered that question. What it's adding is it's enabling you to make choices based in a value system, and that value system is registered in the form of feelings. That's how the organism knows this is going badly for me. If I carry on down this path, I'm going to die. Not in words. I mean, we're talking about rather simple creatures in terms of the evolution of consciousness. But there's certain brain structures that we know perform these functions in our brains. In other words, it's not a mystery where anatomically and physiologically speaking, where these dynamics are going on. It's in the brain stem. It's in the reticular activating system and the periaqueductal gray that raw feelings are generated. And I think anything that has that anatomical equipment, that it feels like something to be such a creature. And I think that equipment enables that creature to feel like something, and that enables it to survive in unpredicted environments. So it's not that if you just described it from the outside, you would be missing an absolutely fundamental functional contribution of this anatomy and physiology, which is that it's enabling the creature to register its own states. and in its own states in terms of matters of existential consequence. I think that the problem, the mistake we've made in neuroscience, in the neuroscience of consciousness, is to use human consciousness, the highest forms of reflective human cognition, as our model example of what we mean by consciousness. So please understand that what I'm saying is, if we reduce consciousness to its elemental form, in other words, to raw feeling, it's not such a mystery to see what it adds. It's not such a mystery to see why it evolved. And it's not such a mystery to see why it can't be accounted for without taking. You cannot explain the behavior of an organism that makes choices without including in your formalism, in your explanation of what it is that's determining what it does. How is it that it's making these choices? On the basis of what? And I'm saying it's on the basis of feelings, which predict its demise or survival. That's what feelings add. That's what they do. If you just had that hardware without the feeling, then it wouldn't be doing that. And in fact, as I say, then it wouldn't be the same hardware, because that's what that hardware evolved for. That's what it does. Makes it possible for the animal to register its own state subjectively, which is an enormous biological adaptive advantage.
Well, so when I think of free will, I'm a compatibilist, so I think that free will is just another determined physical process. So I don't think there's any genuine 100% choices that aren't determined by other physical processes. And I think that I agree with your purpose of consciousness as a way to self-reflect about your experiences, but I don't think I need to say that that's not physical to say that it exists. I can say, yeah, it's purely physical. It's a weakly emergent process in the brain. It does do all of those things, but I don't need to posit some kind of um, substance or property dualism of some kind to explain that. It seems like I can explain it just fine with only matter. I don't understand. And by consensus, when I mentioned the consensus, there's a number of polls for academics in all of these fields, and they all tend to agree. Physicalism, materialism is the most prominent view. It's not literally everyone agrees with it. It's just the majority view of the people in the field, the academics in the field. That's why it's the consensus. But I don't see why we would need to posit anything more than just the physical world. I think consciousness can be fully explained as emergent, just like hearts can be fully explained as emergence. And I don't see, when you say choices and free will, are you talking about something that's completely outside of the material world altogether? Because I don't see those kinds of choices anywhere, or any evidence of those kinds of choices.
Well, you continue to use the word material and physical as if they were identical terms, and they're not. I do not claim that this account that I've just sketched for you is anything other than a physicalist account. I'm saying that consciousness is part of the physical universe. It's something that happens to systems, which complex, dynamical, self-organizing systems, which have the properties that I've just described to you. They register
Right.
their.
Just to clarify, I'm not saying those are the same. I'm saying the consensus view is both physicalism and materialism. That's why I'm saying physicalism, materialism combined, because you can also have physicalism, but also a different kind of
Yeah,
metaphysical substrate. So I'm saying the consensus is physicalism, materialism, as in both of those.
yeah.
Not saying that they're the same.
Okay, so I'm a physicalist, dual aspect monist. I'm not a physicalist materialist. And the reason for that is that I don't think that you can, if it's only a matter of matter, in other words, if you're only describing the properties of the system from the point of view of its external appearances, you're missing something fundamental about how that system works. That system has other phenomena. Those phenomena are registered subjectively. And those things are not material. You can't see them. You can't touch them. Nevertheless, they exist. They're part of the physical universe in the physics sense of the word of physical, which is why I draw upon information theory, the genealogy of which I outlined for you in thumbnail sketch a moment ago. It starts with Claude Shannon, introducing into physics the idea of information. I think that what the brain is doing, the brain looked at from the outside is the mind looked at from the inside. And the underlying laws governing the behavior of this thing manifests externally as a material brain and internally as a psychological mind. The underlying dynamics can best be formulated in the language of information science. Information science is physical science. You can't have quantum mechanics without a concept of information. Information is thoroughly ingrained in contemporary physics. In this sense, I'm a physicalist. I'm drawing upon information science. But I'm saying that information dynamics of the kind that we're talking about here, the information processing dynamics of a complex self-organizing system with these kind of non-iterative dynamics, the choice-making kind, that information has dual aspects. That you can look at it as nerve impulses from the outside. That's all very well and good. You learn a great deal that way. But it also manifests as subjective experience from the inside. It feels like something to that brain. And that feeling does something. That's what I keep on saying.
So the consciousness itself does something. That's something I'd probably disagree with. I think the consciousness is a reflection of the physical particles, and the choices the consciousness makes is probably also going to be a reflection of the physical particles. So I don't think you actually need consciousness to exist and do something independent of the physical particles that make it up.
But you're using the word physical particles in the materialist sense. I would say, yes, it is a manifestation of the physical information, the information processing of a certain kind of complex dynamics. You see, it's not just, not all information has dual aspects, but information processing by a self-organizing system with these kinds of dynamics, that system registers the information processing in the form of consciousness. Now, I agree with you that more fundamental than the conscious feeling is the informational dynamics. And that's why I said earlier that if you're a dual aspect monist, you have to say, well, then, if there are these dual aspects, the material physical brain and the psychological subjective mind, if these are dual manifestations of a single underlying thing, what is that underlying thing made of? And I'm saying it's made of that part. It's best described by that part of physics that we call information science, which is part of a bigger part of physics called statistical mechanics. And so to go back to your question about free will, all the probabilistic accounts of free will, can be fitted into the framework that I'm talking to you about. Ultimately, I agree, there's no such thing as radical free will, but there is choice, and this choice is tethered to feelings. So Daniel can indeed, by free will, enter the lion's den, but most of us won't. Why? Because it feels bloody scary to enter a lion's den. And that scary feeling evolved for a reason. It's because it predicts your demise. If you're in a situation in which you're likely to be torn limb from limb, it feels scary. And so you tend not to do that sort of thing. And that's why feelings exist. That's why feelings evolved, is that they dissuade us from entering lions' dens. And in this sense, free will is probabilistic. The degrees of freedom are dictated by feelings. And that's how we register them. We actually feel them. So the actual feeling of them does something. But I agree with you, you have to be able to explain the causal dynamics in language beyond the phenomena. In other words, something has to explain the phenomena, the two sets of phenomena, the physiological phenomena and the psychological phenomena. And I use the language of information science to do that. As Galileo said, the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. I agree with that.
But why do we need to posit this dual aspect monism to say that consciousness can do something? It seems like consciousness as purely just the physical stuff. If we look at only the physical stuff, the particles, just the particles, ignoring the information bit, just the particles, it seems like we could still predict potentially the actions if we knew everything of what an agent is going to do, without any positing of any kind of dual aspect monism where there's this consciousness thing. It seems like we just don't need that. We can just say, yeah, it's just the particles and the energy. Who cares about the rest?
Well, you could say the same. Just forgive me. I don't want to use the word particles. I want to use the word underlying physical dynamics, okay? Because particles imply something that you can see. I'm saying that there is an information processing dynamics going on, which is certainly physical. I mean, this is part of physical science. Information is part of physical science. So there's an underlying causal process there. And the question is, why does it manifest in any appearance at all? You're saying, well, it manifests as a brain. That's unproblematical. But why must it manifest as a mind? I'm saying, no, why should it manifest as a brain any more than a mind? These are appearances. These are ways in which we're able to perceive, we're able to register the existence of these underlying dynamics. The fact that it feels like something is no more problematical than the fact that it looks like something. And so, in fact, I would even go so far as to say the fact that it looks like something is a little bit more difficult to explain than why it feels like something. Because the most important thing is that the system is able to register its own states and behave accordingly. The reason why it looks like something is because if I can translate it into words, the organism feels like this, I feel like this, and then it becomes a question of about that. I feel like this about that thing that I can see is what's causing me to feel like this. But both of them are phenomena. Both of them are manifestations of the underlying causal dynamics. The underlying language we're talking about is the language of information. It's a mathematical language. It's a physical language in the sense of physics. It's not a physical language in the sense of biology. It's not a physical language in the sense of visualizable things. I think that it's a neuroscientific and a psychological question as to why we visualize things and why we feel things. These are both of them experiences.
So let me answer the question from my side, just to give you an example. I think that the reason there is nothing more fundamental than matter and energy, or quantum fields in this case, is that those models have made novel, successful predictions that can accurately describe things that we didn't know before we knew them. And there hasn't been any kind of dual aspect predictions, as far as I know, that differentiate itself as a theory from just regular materialism. And so, of all of the different things that we can say functionally construct the universe, it requires novel predictions to confirm any hypothesis. And yours sounds like a hypothesis from my perspective that hasn't been confirmed. I don't see any kind of confirmatory data that says this is. We have reason to believe that there's this dual aspect thing because of this kind of novel prediction or something that's been made. It seems more like you're saying that consciousness must do something, and that doing something must be independent of the parts that make it. It has to have some kind of causal influence, and the causal influence of consciousness can't be explained purely from the materialistic description of it. And therefore, we have to posit a kind of dual aspect monism, which I don't think, or I think it's fine as a hypothesis, but until you've confirmed it with some kind of novel prediction that it can demonstrate itself to be independent of just our imagination, I don't think it counts as a justification to believe it's true yet.
Well, let me be clear that I do believe that there is something more fundamental than the experience. These are the causal dynamics that explain the experience, but those same causal dynamics explain the physiology. They explain why the brain is doing what it's doing in no more or less fundamental a way than they explain why the mind is doing what it's doing. Your starting point is that we can see things called brains. I'm saying, oh no, you can't. If you don't have eyes, you're not going to see brains. The brains are things that manifest as phenomena to us. From the point of view of a physicist, they don't look like something. They have underlying dynamics which are described in terms of abstract formulations written in the language of mathematics. Why should anything appear like anything at all? A great prejudice is that the way that things appear to us human beings is the way that they are. No, it's not. It's the way they appear to us because we have certain apparatus which registers them in certain way. And I'll tell you something else. We only register those things that interest us. So, all of this ultimately also comes back to the motivational, affective, experiential side of things, which is rooted in our survival and reproductive success, which is a value system, which is what underpins feelings. So I'm saying, yes, sure, there's an underlying dynamics. You're saying, but why do you need to explain something more than what the dynamics is doing? But you're equating those dynamics with physiology, with what can be seen with one's eyes. And I'm saying, no, that's not the fundamental dynamics. That's an appearance of those dynamics when looked at from the outside with human eyes. There's another appearance of those dynamics when looked at from the inside. Those are feelings. Both of them are phenomena. Both of them are appearances. I'm not saying that the phenomena are more fundamental than the underlying causal dynamics. You're conflating the underlying causal dynamics with the physiology. I think that's a very common error. And
well,
I
I'm
think
not doing, just to clarify, that's not at all what I'm doing. What I'm saying is that we have a methodology to differentiate imagination from reality, which is novel testable predictions. I don't care about whether you see it or whether you feel it or whether it's something we can observe. None of that matters to me. I don't care. I want to know, can your hypothesis make predictions about the future that we don't know yet? Because that's the only way to verify that it's actually true. So it doesn't matter to me the methodology that you get to it through vision or through experience or feelings. Don't care.
So what I'm saying is that a system that's able to make choices in a novel environment, that this system, the choices are guided by feelings. If the feelings were not there, it would not be able to display that behavior. It would not be able to make choices in unpredicted novel situations. That's what feelings do. That's what I'm saying. So I'm saying that if you were to...
I understand that part, but I can agree with all of that and say nothing about dual aspect monism. I don't even need to mention. I can say, yep, all physical, nothing more, or all material, nothing more.
Perhaps I'm not understanding you. If what you're saying is, can I prove my metaphysical position, then you're misunderstanding the meaning of the word metaphysics. Metaphysical positions are positions that one adopts. They're not empirically demonstrable. You can't prove that idealism is not true and materialism is true. These are metaphysical positions. To me, the metaphysical position that makes the most sense is the dual aspect monist one. It's not something that you can empirically demonstrate is better than a materialist position, but I'll remind you that the same applies the other way around. You can't empirically prove that a materialist position is better than a dual aspect monist one. Because, what about the feelings? What are they doing? Why do they exist? How do they fit within your worldview? You're saying, well, it doesn't know. It's not clear. They just seem to sort of float about. I'm saying, no, they do something.
Well, so I'm saying that you can't prove anything, but materialism has evidence. We have evidence matter exists. We have no evidence that there's anything more to consciousness than matter. All evidence in every academic field says consciousness is emergent from matter and there's nothing more. Nothing. There's nothing to indicate it's more than that. And it seems like you're saying the reason you want to posit more than that is because, well, we can't explain it yet.
No, when you said we have evidence that matter exists, just pause there. We have evidence that feelings exist.
Yep.
Okay. Right here and now, you and I are both busy experiencing that evidence.
Yeah, but there's no evidence that feelings are more than just the matter. Like there's lots of evidence that shows matter.
I mean, here I am busy experiencing it. You're saying, well, it's reducible to matter, and I'm saying, show me with my eyes. Show me something that I can see that is a feeling, and I'll tell you that's not a feeling. What you're showing me is a neurotransmitter, or what you're showing me is a nerve impulse, or what you're showing me is an arousal state as registered by EEG or whatever. But it's not a feeling. It's no more fundamental than the feeling.
So identitarianism is the position that those are the feelings. So if I'm showing you those, I'm showing you the feelings. But the point here is that the bigger issue.
This is an empirical position. That is nonsense. To say that thing is the feeling is a metaphysical claim. It's to my mind, it's manifestly not the feeling. It's a physiological thing. It's not a feeling. Where's the feeling? I can't see it.
So that's not the important point of the argument. The important part of the argument here is that I have lots of verification, justification to believe matter is fundamental and makes everything else. I have no reason to think feelings are in any way not a product of matter. There's no other anything else in the universe that it could be made of. There's no evidence of any other fundamental anything that could produce anything other than just material processes. So that's the only game in town, is we got matter and that's it. And so if you want to say there's some dual aspect, that other aspect that you're saying isn't just material has no evidence. You're simply saying that because you can't fully explain or see a feeling or something, therefore you're justified in positing it as a new kind of ontology, which isn't the case. That's a hypothesis. But to justify a hypothesis, you need novel predictions. Material hypotheses have all made novel predictions all the time. We get those right. So we have lots and lots of justification to say matter is real, matter is metaphysically real, which you can justify metaphysical positions. Some are less reasonable than others. And materialism is the most justified metaphysical position based on the evidence we have. And so it seems like you're simply saying that because you can't give a physical account of feelings, therefore you can posit a completely new ontology with no actual evidence other than the fact that this other hypothesis can't explain it, which doesn't seem rational.
I'm sorry, the reason we're going around in circles is you continue to use the word physical and material as if they were identical, and they're not.
No, I'm not doing that. That isn't
Okay.
my question. My
So,
question is materialism
I'm
is
not
the
claiming
only
some
game in
fun-
town. Materialism
No,
is the only thing that has evidence. There is no evidence for any other position other than materialism. The only fundamental essence is materialism, with all of novel test predictions indicating that and nothing else. So I'm rational in saying materialism is it. That's the only explanation. You're saying there's another thing based on the fact that materialism can't explain feelings, and that seems to be the only justification.
Yeah, so just to be clear, are you saying materialism and physicalism are the same position?
No.
Okay, so then can we drop the word materialism for a moment? And let's just say physicalism. You and I are both physicalists.
Right, I agree with that, but that's not my question.
Right.
My question is materialism is my position. Materialism seems more rational than dual aspect monism. There seems to be lots of evidence for materialism, not physicalism. Materialism, the only thing that exists is matter. That's the position I'm defending here.
No, that's not true. It's not
what
true.
what
I mean,
what
we
part of
both
that is not
agreed
true?
earlier in contemporary physics, the matter is not considered a fundamental property of the universe. So matter is not fundamental. There are things which are more fundamental than matter. So in that sense, we are both physicalists. Okay.
No. So all of those things are still physical or all material. So quantum fields are material things. They're still material. Energy is material.
Information is not material.
All material. Information is material.
No, it's not.
So I'm a materialist. Everything is material, and that's the position that is the consensus view in pretty much every field.
So that's what I'm saying. It's a position that you take, but it's just a metaphysical position. You can't demonstrate empirically that a materialist interpretation of physicalism is better than a dual aspect interpretation of physicalism.
Yes,
well, let me just remind you of how the argument works from my side. Okay. I'm saying we're both physicalists, and I'm saying as a physicalist, there seem to be two types of phenomenon that I can register. The one type is material things, which I touch, I taste, I hear, they are physical material things. And then there are physical psychological things, which I also observe, like feelings. You can't see a feeling with your eyes. You can't weigh it on a scale. You can't taste it with your tongue. Nevertheless, it exists. So I'm saying these are not spooky things which require a different ontology that somehow can't be related to material things. I'm saying that some material things have a subjective aspect. And the question is, why do those material things, but not all material things, have a subjective aspect? And I'm saying it's something about the physical dynamics of those material things give rise to them having both an external physical appearance and an internal psychical appearance. You're saying it's so self-evidently true that all there is matter, and I'm saying
no, not self-evident. This has nothing to do with self-evidence. This is all about novel testable predictions. Which model?
I've given you the testable prediction. A thing that doesn't have feelings is unable to make choices in novel situations. That's what I'm saying.
What laboratory test can we do with that to confirm a prediction? That's not a prediction. That's a non-diction. So you're saying something that doesn't have this can't do this. That's not a prediction. What we need is a novel testable prediction, something we don't know yet, something about the universe nobody's seen yet, that we can predict we're going to see under some laboratory conditions and get it right before we know it. That's a novel testable prediction. That's all of how science works. And so in the case of materialism, we've made material predictions about what we would expect in the material world if materialism was true and we got them right, which justifies belief materialism is the correct metaphysics. Now, in order to say that there is something else in addition to the physical world, you would need to make novel testable predictions about things we don't know yet and get them right, which entails some kind of a new property or new ontology. And until you do that, there is zero evidence for the new ontology. Right now, all of the evidence is materialism, and that's it. There's only novel predictions that have ever been successfully made are under the materialist paradigm. And so until a new set of predictions can be confirmed under laboratory experimental tests, then there is no plausible justification for anything but materialism. And so it's plausible to say materialism is the correct metaphysics, and that it explains everything, including consciousness, even if we don't have like a strict definition of how consciousness fits into materialism. It's more plausible to think that materialism explains consciousness because we already have evidence materialism explains pretty much everything, and that's the only evidence of anything as far as we can tell. And for that reason, it's like saying if we see an unknown hoof print in the snow, it's more plausible to say a horse did it than a unicorn did it, because we have lots of evidence horses exist. We have no evidence unicorns exist. And so if you want to say that there's this new ontology of this dual aspect thing that's out there, that would be like a unicorn. You would first have to provide evidence that unicorn actually exists as an independent thing, because we already have evidence matter exists and makes lots of stuff.
Well, I'm afraid we have plenty of evidence that feelings exist and do lots of stuff.
Just to clarify, I'm not talking about the feelings. The feelings exist, but what I'm talking about is the dual aspect. When you're saying it is this other ontology, that's the thing that we have no evidence exists. I agree feelings exist, but the dual aspect thing, that we don't have any evidence for.
So for you, feelings are material things?
Yes, 100%.
Which is very hard to square with the actual phenomenology of feelings. Because what you're actually saying is feelings translated into the language of matter. If we look at them only in terms of their material manifestations, then we can track all the causal sequences.
Yes.
And I'm saying, yeah, but then why does it not only have a material manifestation? Why does it also have a psychological manifestation? The psychological manifestation is clearly there for a reason. You're saying, no, it's not there for a reason.
Well, no, I'm saying it's also physical. The psychological manifestation is also physical.
That's just clearly nonsensical to say something that is. I mean, I'm not the first person in the history of philosophy to be saying that feelings are not material things. For heaven's sake, it's been a problem for centuries.
Right. I agree. I agree with that. But my question here is that I have a justification. I don't know how feelings can be reduced to matter, or we don't have that answer yet. But I'm saying that the position that it can be and will be in future is a more plausible position inherently than to say that it's an entirely new kind of thing, because we have evidence of the physical stuff already existing. Physical stuff makes everything we see in the universe, as far as we can tell. And so it's more rational to say that it's going to be discovered to be made of physical stuff than to posit an entirely new ontology of dual aspect monism, panpsychism, idealism, anything. Any of those that say there's a new ontology that does not have evidence is always going to be less rational to believe, because we don't have any evidence of those things. We do have evidence of material stuff. And so it's always going to be more rational to say that anything we see in the universe, even if we can't explain it yet, is going to be material or explained by material in the future, than to say that it's this new ontology that has no evidence, until such time as you provide novel, testable, confirmed predictions for this new ontology. It will always be less plausible than just saying, nah, it's material.
Well, you said two things there which are not quite the same thing. On the one hand, you're saying that you accept that there are psychological things. In other words, there are things like feelings which are not currently explainable as material things. You can't account for them from a materialist point of view. Then you're saying, however, we do know that matter exists. Therefore, it's plausible that the feelings must be reducible to matter. But why do you say that second thing? The second thing, it's exactly the same as to say in the obverse. You could say, well, we have absolute evidence that feelings exist. Therefore, the most plausible position is that matter will ultimately be reducible to feelings, which is an idealist position. And I'm saying no. That's neither of those positions is correct. We have absolute evidence, empirical evidence. In other words, we experience it. We have empirical evidence that matter exists, and we have empirical evidence that feelings exist. You can't reduce the feelings to material processes. You yourself have conceded that. I'm not wishing to reduce the material processes to psychical ones. I'm not an idealist. I'm saying more plausible than either of those positions is to say that there's something else, something that explains both of them, that explains both phenomena. That's the dual aspect monist view. You're saying it's a whole new ontology. Let me remind you, It's Baruch Spinoza's ontology. It's not something new. This is something
new here doesn't mean literally it was invented newly. New means that it posits an ontology that has not yet been demonstrated to exist independent of our imagination. So matter has been demonstrated to wait, just to clarify, matter has been demonstrated to exist independent of our imagination. It is a far above and beyond the evidence of any other ontology here, because we see it. That part doesn't matter. What matters is that it makes novel, testable predictions about the future and gets them right. That matters. That is significant. So the feelings, I agree, feelings exist. That tells us nothing about their ontology. You can posit that it has its own ontology, like an idealist. You're not doing that, obviously. But if someone does that, they have no evidence. They have nothing. They have nothing to base that off. It's just a hypothesis. If the materialist says, I think matter is independent of the mind and metaphysically true, they have a lot to base that on. They have novel testable predictions. They have successful evidence. So it's not just the fact that we see it. It's the successful ability to predict the future that we don't know yet and get it right. That's the evidence. And so because materialists have the novel testable predictions, they can rationally posit that materialism exists as a fundamental nature of reality, where the idealists cannot, because they don't have any novel successful predictions of their posited consciousness fundamental ontology. And I think the same thing would apply to your view that there's a dual aspect monism seems to have equally no successful novel predictions, just like the idealists have no successful novel predictions. And so the materialist position, the paradigm, seems to have significant evidence to make it plausible to be an explanation of literally anything we ever discover in reality, because it makes successful predictions. And until some other worldview makes successful predictions, it doesn't count. It's not at the same level as the material hypothesis, even if we don't know how to explain the particular phenomenon yet.
Well, all I can say is that's a metaphysical position, and you're welcome to it. I do not find that position, your position, as you've just articulated it. You keep on convincing yourself, obviously, but I'm likewise continuing to convince myself. These are metaphysical positions, and I just do not agree that the materialist position is more evidence-based than the dual aspect monist position, because the dual aspect monist position takes account of more of the evidence. In other words, it takes account also of the feelings, and they seem to be doing something. In my life, they do a hell of a lot. And that's empirically observable. I can see, when I feel pain, I withdraw my limb from the stimulus. When I feel fear, I avoid the place that it causes me fear. When I feel ecstatic joy, I want to repeat that experience. The experience is doing something. Now, you're saying, as a matter of metaphysical faith, you're saying, well, actually, I think those are just material processes. And I'm saying,
no, that's the part I'm disagreeing with. It's not faith. The difference here is that we're describing a phenomenon, and in the process of any methodology of how do we explain the phenomenon, the first thing is here's the phenomenon. You describe it. That's fine, but that's not evidence of nothing. Just describing the phenomenon is evidence of nothing. So feelings exist. That's the phenomenon. Okay. Now I want to go beyond that. What
and explain
causes those feelings? And so this part is where we diverge, because I'm saying that the only thing that counts as evidence here is novel testable predictions. You got to make novel testable predictions, and nothing else counts as evidence. And you're saying that, well, I can explain it, and that counts as evidence. Well, I think, no, that doesn't count as evidence at all. Anybody can make up an explanation of anything. That's not a way to show that it actually is true. And so from my perspective, Things that have successfully made novel predictions are material, matter, energy, quantum fields. Those have made successful predictions. Dual aspect monism has not made novel predictions. Therefore, anything that has successfully made novel predictions is a better explanation than anything that has not made successful novel predictions. Therefore, it's more rational to infer materialism as the cause of anything than dual aspect monism or idealism, because neither of those have made predictions yet. And you're saying that, well, you don't need predictions. What you need is a conceptual framework that explains the data or something along those lines. And I think that's the part where we disagree.
Well, it sounds like you don't think that feelings are evidence.
No, feelings are the phenomenon. They're not evidence. They're the thing that we're trying to
So
explain.
you're
So they
saying
can't be
things
evidence.
that you see are evidence, but things that you feel are not evidence.
No, I'm saying things that can accurately predict the future are evidence. I don't care if you see them or feel them.
So that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that with you start with a framework, with a causal explanatory framework, and you say, given this framework, the following phenomena will occur. That's the whole experimental method.
Yeah.
And I'm saying I have a framework, and I'm saying, given this framework, I predict that under such and such circumstances, the following phenomena will occur. And those phenomena include feelings. And you're saying, well, you're not accounting for the feelings. You're only accounting for the for the physiology. And I'm saying, but then why do the feelings also manifest? And you're saying, well, actually, because they are really physiological. And I'm saying, but they're not physiological. They're psychological. Can't you see that?
Yeah, but what are your? You said that.
So the experimental paradigm is I have a theory, and my theory predicts the following phenomena will occur. My dual aspect monist paradigm predicts phenomena will occur, but under some circumstances there will be feelings. Under other circumstances there will not be feelings. Your framework doesn't take account of the feelings. It's saying
so just to clarify, evidence is novel testable prediction. So you have to predict something we don't know yet. So what is your prediction of something we don't know yet? Because we all know feelings exist. That's something we already know. That's the phenomenon. So for it to be evidence, it has to be something we don't know yet. What's the thing we don't know?
I don't know what you mean by what's the thing we don't know yet. I mean, for example, I predict that if I stick a pin in your finger, you will feel pain.
We already know that.
And as a result of that pain, you will withdraw your finger.
You're saying
no. You're saying no. I'm withdrawing my finger.
No. That we already know that. That's not novel. So novel is like, I'm going to predict that in 10 years an asteroid's going to hit the Earth, because we don't know that. We have no evidence of that. There's nothing that indicates that yet. So a novel means predicting something we don't already know. Like if I predict the sun's going to rise tomorrow, we already know that. Everybody already knows that. That's a piece of the hypothesis. So if I predict that if I stick you with a needle, you're going to feel pain and pull away, we already know that. That's a part of the phenomenon. For it to be evidence, you need to predict something we don't know yet, something that is unknown, something that we do not already see. So predicting things we already see, like people experience pain, they will withdraw, they will make decisions, that's already known. So that can't be evidence. That's the phenomenon. To be evidence has to be something we don't know yet.
Well, I'm afraid within your framework, there is something we don't know yet, but you're eliding that bit. You're eliding the bit is we don't know yet within a materialist framework. We don't know yet why the feeling is registered by you.
I agree, but that's not so evidence is being able to predict the answer to that under some condition. Here's a test we can do.
So I'm saying in the absence of the feeling, the behavior will be different. I'm saying the feeling is doing something, and therefore we need an explanatory framework which accounts for that phenomenon too, which incorporates that. I've just told you. Right. I mean, like you can if I anesthetize you, I believe you will not withdraw.
Well, we already know that, so that's not novel. So how do you make a novel prediction of something we don't know yet and confirm it in a laboratory result?
I'm sorry, but within your framework, you're not able to account for what
that doesn't matter. Does. It doesn't matter what my framework does.
You're saying what I'm saying is not novel. I'm saying what's novel about it is it's explaining something that can't be explained, which actually happens, but you just leave it out of your worldview. You actually like scottomatize it. You don't see that part of it. It's as if it doesn't exist. And
Well,
I'm
no. So
saying,
I'm
well,
saying explanations don't matter. It doesn't matter if you can explain something. Anybody can make up an explanation of anything. That's just a hypothesis. That's what a hypothesis is. To confirm the hypothesis, you need to make a prediction which can be confirmed under some experiments repeatably and testably. That's what you need to confirm the
yeah.
hypothesis. So I
So
grant that
my
you can
prediction
explain
is
things.
if you remove the feeling, the behavior will differ. And you're saying we already know that, and I'm saying, well, you materialists don't know that because your materialist Weltanschauung doesn't take account of the feeling.
Well, so okay, so you would need to give me a test of how I can remove the feeling without affecting the material stuff.
No, I don't believe you can do it without affecting the material stuff, because remember, I'm a dual aspect monist.
Right. So we
I'm
already
saying
know
there
that
is a material
affecting.
parallel. The material is, there's no such thing as a subjective experience without it having simultaneously a material objective manifestation. I'm
Well, this is
saying
why
what
it's
needs,
not novel, because you're saying that if we mess with the material stuff in the brain, the actions will differ. Yes, we already know that. That's something we
and
already
vice
know.
versa, my friend. If you mess with the subjective stuff, it will also have material manifestations. If I produce a feeling state, in fact, I can show you positron emission tomographic scans of the evidence of this, that I have a person who's in a state of rage. It's a subjective feeling. I have another person who's in a state of anxiety, fear. It's a subjective feeling, qualitatively utterly different from rage. And the positron emission tomogram is different. You see different things materially going on because there's different things going on subjectively. This experiment that I'm talking about was published in Nature in 2000 by Damasio, and the people who were generating the feelings were actors. So in other words, from within themselves, the causal agent was a subjective state generated by an actor. And then that produces a change in the brain that you can see from the outside. And your way of thinking is the one is producing the other. My way of thinking is no, they're dual manifestations of the same underlying process. Just as when I wake up in the morning, I feel myself to be Mark Solms, that's my mind, I exist. I then walk over to the mirror and I see my body there, and I think, well, that's also Mark Solms, I exist. They're two different ways of registering the same thing. That's all that I'm saying. So you're saying, well, the one causes the other, therefore the physical causes the mental. I'm saying no, the physical doesn't, in the material sense. The material doesn't cause the mental any more than the mental causes the material. You can do it in both directions. The real underlying causal framework has to account for both of those. That's why I'm saying I'm a physicalist. I'm not a materialist. I want to be able to explain both of them.
Well,
You,
I think you're still stuck on this explaining thing, and I don't understand what about you just said is a novel prediction that actors can cause different brain states, which can have different psychological effects or physiological effects in the brain. Like, yeah, we already knew that too. I don't know what about that is novel. But we have a super chat from Samir. Even orphan dogs know to bury their bones for later retrieval. Is that DNA? Is it material? Babies also know to search for nipples when their eyes closed. Yes, those are both material, and those are both. Some of them are a result of DNA. So that was a question for me, I guess, because it was not. He's more on your side. He doesn't. He thinks that.
So that's a nice example. The searching for the nipple. There's a reflex. It's the rooting reflex. There's another reflex, which is the sucking reflex. Both of those things don't require consciousness. But in the process of learning how to latch onto a nipple, and why, in rooting isn't looking for a nipple, rooting is just rooting. Then a nipple is placed in the mouth, and then the infant has the feeling of hunger being satisfied. And so now in future, the infant is seeking to, the neonate is seeking to reproduce that experience. So the feeling of that particular thing in my mouth, taking away my hunger, has causal consequences for what the neonate does next. Likewise with the sucking reflex. So reflexes are one thing. Learning from experience is another thing. Experience fundamentally includes feeling, and it explains a hell of a lot about what the neonate does in this instance.
All right. I think that was it for the super chats, actually. But yeah, I think that's our fundamental disagreement is the methodology proposed to justify belief in the hypothesis. I think you're looking at the data and explaining it, and saying that that's sufficient to justify belief in dual aspect monism. I'm saying that is not. You would need novel predictions to confirm that hypothesis, and until you had those, it would not be sufficient.
Well, you're counting my predictions as not being predictions because you're saying you can also trace that same causal pathway from a purely material point of view. And so I just need to be sure that you understand this bit of what I'm saying. I do not believe that there is such a thing as a psychological experience without there being a parallel material physiological process. I don't think that the psychological things float in the ether independently of physiological processes. What I'm saying, what needs explaining is why those physiological processes are accompanied by psychological experiences. I'm saying that your Weltanschauung does not account for the experiences. You saying as a matter of faith, you believe sometime in future it will be possible to explain within a materialistic point of view why the feelings are actually just material stuff. And I'm saying that's a hell of a leap of faith because there's no good reason to believe that as far as I'm concerned. I think far more reasonable is to say we need a Weltanschauung that can account for both sets of phenomena. And to me, that's self-evidently as reasonable as your view is to you.
Right. So I think the accounting for something isn't evidence. I think that you can make up any hypothesis to account for anything. I think that, and so your predictions were not novel. They're things we already knew. So that's why I didn't accept them. Like you have to predict things we literally, no one has any idea this is going to happen yet, kind of a thing. Not just, hey, something we already know is extremely common, and we're going to predict the thing we already know is extremely common. Like that's like the sun rising. Predicting the sun rising tomorrow isn't going to be evidence of like the flying spaghetti monster because we already know it. Everyone knows that.
No. I'll tell you, I think that, I mean, you seem to not really be capable of hearing what I'm saying because you're so set in your worldview. So let me just try one more time to get a little crack into that worldview of doubt so that you can just think about what I'm saying to you. I'm saying that within your worldview, you're actually leaving out a hell of a lot of the evidence, that there are things that are happening which you are not able to account for. And you're saying, well, one day in future, we will be able to account for those. And I'm saying that's a problematical scientific approach, leaving out a lot of the evidence and saying, but my explanation explains all of this evidence. And I'm saying, yeah, but it doesn't explain that evidence. And you're saying, well, one day it will. That's not a good scientific worldview. You're parodying what I'm saying as if, it's some kind of like lick and promise. And I'm saying, well, the sun's going to rise tomorrow. That's my novel prediction. I'm saying that there are things I can predict will happen that your materialist view cannot account for unless you accept your faith that actually those things which are not material really are material. One day they will be proven to be material. And I'm saying, well, that day is very long, hundreds of years, it hasn't come yet. That's what I'm saying.
Well, to me, that sounds like an argument from ignorance. You can't explain this. I can make up an explanation for this. It's like the God argument. You can't explain why there was an earthquake. God did it is my explanation. Therefore, my explanation is better because I can account for the data. It's just an argument from ignorance. Like saying that the problem here is that you don't get to posit an explanation of anything with a grounding or an ontology that has no evidence yet. So it doesn't matter if you can say, I can posit that feelings are a dual ontology and they can explain this. Anybody can posit a new kind of thing that can explain something. What matters is can you give independent evidence of that thing outside of the fact that you're making it up to explain the data. It's post hoc to make it up to explain the data. What we need is, okay, after you hypothesize this thing exists to explain the data, how can you independently confirm it exists? And to do that, you need novel testable predictions. And that means predicting something nobody knows yet. It can't be the things we already know. And so predicting that messing with the brain will cause different kinds of feelings or different kinds of feelings will cause different kinds of experiences in the brain. We already know all of that. That's like predicting the sun will rise tomorrow. You need to predict something we don't know yet, something that no one has any idea of yet. And then you can claim that this hypothesis makes novel predictions and can be justified to conclude that it explains the data. But until then, all you have is a hypothesis. And so I'm fine to grant most of what you said, that yes, we can't explain we can't explain feelings yet, and I'm positing that one day in the future we probably will. And then you say that's less reasonable because it doesn't explain the data or doesn't account for the evidence. And I'm saying I don't care about accounting for the evidence. Anybody can make something up to account for the evidence. What we need is an independent verification of whatever they make up is actually true. And matter has that for other things, not for feelings. And because matter has that for other things, it has a grounded basis to be an explanatory basis for anything because it's been proven to exist in reality, whereas all of the other things are just hypotheses with no independent basis.
We're going around in circles. Sorry, I tried my best. Feelings exist just as much as matter does.
Samir, another super chat. Mark is right. How do you explain that the brain smudge from billions of people who can agree women are attractive or not, yet everyone likes their mom? Something. Yes, that's purely explained by evolution. You can do a Google search for the evolution of attractiveness. It's fairly common.
Attractiveness is not a material process. Attractiveness
100%.
is no, it can be, you can observe the physiology of it from the outside, but that isn't the actual feeling of attraction.
Feeling is a product of the material process and nothing more. It's fully material.
That's your act of faith.
Evidence. So Winston's mom asks, do you consider emotions to be the same as feelings?
Emotions are a subset of feelings. Unfortunately, people use these words in different ways, and so I'm not saying my way of using these words is correct. I just want to be clear about how I use the words. Feelings are subjective states which have a valence and a quality. In other words, hunger is a feeling, sleepiness is a feeling, pain is a feeling. Those are not emotions. Emotions like fear, rage, separation, distress, and so on, they too are feelings, but we call them emotional feelings because they're not bodily states. They're not about here and now states of the body, but rather, depending on how you want to approach the matter, you could either say that they are longer term predictions of the state of the body. For example, fear is trepidation that I might experience pain if I were to enter that situation, but I'm not actually experiencing pain now. It's not a bodily state now. That's one way of saying, how emotional feelings relate to bodily feelings. Another way of saying how emotional feelings relate to bodily feelings is emotional feelings have to do with predicting other minds. Rather than predicting what will happen if in relation to this thing. So, for example, I predict that if I eat that apple, my hunger will disappear. Is very different from I predict that if I behave in such and such a way, then that person will reciprocate my love. That's an emotional feeling, and it's much more difficult to predict the behavior of other minds than it is to predict the behavior of mere objects. So this is why we differentiate emotional feelings from bodily feelings, but they're all part of a bigger, broader category called feelings in general, which, as I say, have those properties. They're subjective, they're valenced, and they're qualitatively distinctive.
All right. Mangus Monk ask about twin studies. In twin studies, they seem to share experiences and feelings, etc. Are they one consciousness?
It's an interesting thing about I believe that consciousness is attached to each subject. That it's about my survival, and this is why they evolved. It's that each living creature that is equipped with consciousness, what the consciousness is doing is enhancing the chances of that individual system continuing to exist. Beneath that, there are mechanisms at work, the mechanisms of natural selection. And remember that they do not subserve the continued existence of each individual, but rather of the species. Those deeper mechanisms explain why each individual organism imbued with feelings has its own feelings, but they are its own feelings. They're subjective, they're about me. So I don't think that it makes sense to speak of some kind of super consciousness that transcends the distinction between the two twins. I think each twin has its own feeling states. Obviously, because there's those two objects, those two twins, they share more in terms of their underlying physical properties than two unrelated human beings. There's statistically a very much greater chance that they're going to have the same kinds of feelings in all kinds of situations. But that doesn't mean that their feelings do not belong to each of them alone.
Gotcha. Samir, thank you for the super chat. Even atheists would agree that we have an internal scale for right and wrong. It's very important. It helps us make right decisions. Is it material, TJ? Yes, I think morality is also material. If feelings exist independently from the brain, why are there people with distorted feelings? Do distorted feelings exist waiting to be felt by the correct person?
I presume that question is directed at me. I do not believe that feelings exist independently of the brain. I think that there's certain states of the brain are just what feelings look like when you study them from the outside. They're not then feelings. They rather are visual or other perceptual manifestations of something which from the inside feels like something. So I do not believe there are feelings independently of the brain. However, I do need to take one further step from that and say that once we understand the underlying causal dynamics that generate feelings, that we should be able to artificially engineer them. So in other words, I'm not saying that only brains can feel like something. I'm saying currently the only things that we know that feel like something are brains. But once we get to an understanding of the underlying dynamics, and perhaps this speaks to the question that Tom was asking earlier about novel predictions, I'm saying that it should be possible to engineer a system that has feelings. By that's saying I predict that if I instantiate these physical dynamics, which are the dynamics which we call partially observable Markov decision-making process, that those dynamics, if instantiated in a non-biological system, they should produce a non-biological system that has feelings. That's perhaps a novel prediction within Tom's way of thinking. And in fact, I'm working on such a project with a number of colleagues, computer scientists, roboticists, and physicists.
Well, I definitely agree that is a novel prediction, but it's one that we already make in our field too, because we're trying to make AIs that have consciousness and feelings. We believe that's also possible. So would agree, definitely novel. Let's see, where's the next one? Can you ask him to distinguish his feelings from the Hameroffs calling quantum Darwinism the pleasure principle?
Actually, the pleasure principle, I think, pretty much describes what I'm talking about. It's no different. The pleasure principle, by the way, is not something that Hameroff has coined. That term is a term of Freud's. But Thorndike coined the term law of effect, which was basically explaining, operant conditioning. Rewards and punishments within a purely materialist framework. You can call it the law of effect, which elides the subjective experiences, it leaves out the causal consequences of the experiences themselves. So this principle isn't something that belongs to Hameroff. I like Stuart Hameroff very much, but that principle is not his. What I'm saying is that principle, which has popped up all over the place, it is a fundamental biological phenomenon. That the feelings, pleasurable and unpleasurable feelings, have massive consequences for behavior. That's what that principle is all about, and I think it's the feelings that cause the behavior, and that's what we've been discussing all the time.
Gotcha. Good question asked. Wouldn't it be better to say that feelings exist on a different area of the brain as the prefrontal cortex?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. I just want to say, first of all, that looking at prefrontal cortex is looking at prefrontal cortex. Experiencing a feeling is experiencing a feeling. Now, these two things correlate with each other. And that leads me to the second part of my answer to your question. And again, perhaps this replies to some of the challenges that Tom was putting to me earlier. Actually, I do not believe that prefrontal cortical activation is the physiological correlate of the experiencing of a feeling. In my book, by the way, may I quickly plug my book? I've written a book called The Hidden Spring, which is about everything we've talked about here. It's a physicalist account of consciousness, which is dual aspect monist and not materialist. And everything I've tried to say here in a few words is said there very systematically. So in that book, I give the evidence for my view that feelings are not generated in prefrontal cortex. One example is a patient of mine, Mr. W, whose scans I publish in that study. He has absolutely no prefrontal cortex, but I published there an interview I have with him about his feelings, and he's full of feelings. And in fact, nor is this unusual. What's unusual about my patient is he has absolutely no prefrontal cortex. But in fact, it's commonplace in my field to have patients with prefrontal cortical damage who display more feeling rather than less. If feelings were generated in prefrontal cortex, then damaged prefrontal cortex, you should have less production of feelings. But in fact, you have the opposite. So I believe that prefrontal cortex and cortex in general is not where feelings are generated. Feelings are generated in the brainstem, to put it very simply. Feelings are generated in the periaqueductal gray of the midbrain and the reticular activating system of the upper brainstem. And that there are children who are born with absolutely no cortex. I report that data too. It's called hydranencephaly. They have raw feelings, but they have no cortex at all. So I know that's not what you're asking about. I don't think that's what you're asking about, but I thought I would just mention, when I'm saying that, I'm saying two things. Prefrontal cortex is the physiological manifestation, what you're seeing going on there, of a subjective state. But as it happens in this instance, I do not believe that that feelings, that the physiological correlate of their registration is prefrontal cortical. In fact, it's brainstem.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that does answer what he was asking. So I do believe it was related to where conscious or where feelings are located in the brain. And I would also agree it's definitely in the brainstem, because I have seen the studies that you were mentioning, that there were people with no cortex whatsoever, just the brainstem. And that is very interesting. Heart transplant. Thank you, Samir, for the super chat. Heart transplant recipients become a huge jazz music fan. It turned out the donor was a jazz player. There's a good argument for material, TJ. I don't think so. I don't think the fact that someone's heart being transplanted into someone else and the heart being of a jazz musician made it any more likely that the person was going to like jazz. I think it was just a coincidence that they ended up liking jazz, and that the heart transplant happened to be a jazz musician. I don't think there's any causation between those two. Winston's mom asked, "What about nerves and nerve endings?" Question mark. I don't know what that's specifically asking.
Yeah, I'm also not sure exactly what's being asked there. You perhaps are asking about the about phantom limb phenomena and phantom pain, where the severing of the nerve doesn't result in the loss of sensation in the limb that its nerve ending normally would have projected to. But rather than answering a hypothetical question, I'll just say perhaps that's what you're asking about. But there are many other things you could be asking about. I'll just take the opportunity, while speculating what you're asking about, to make the point that this thing about nerve endings, that we speak about neurotransmission and message passing, across synapses from neuron to neuron. People speak as if that's what neurons do. What very few people seem to realize is that that's what some neurons do. That's synaptic transmission. There's also postsynaptic modulation, and I think that this is greatly underappreciated by people outside of the basic neurosciences, that there are neurons that don't pass messages, they modulate the passing of messages between neurons. And these neuromodulators, they are far more important in terms of affect, in terms of feeling, the main thing that I've been talking about today, than the cognitive message passing itself. Just had an opportunity to get that in.
Gotcha. T asks, even plants have feelings. Do plants have brains?
Well, that's a highly controversial claim to say that plants have feelings. The crucial test, and again, maybe this speaks to what Tom was talking about earlier, is a plant able to solve a novel problem? In other words, is it possible for the plant to make a choice which is not predetermined by the reflexive behaviors of plants? Put a plant into a situation that it has no preparedness for. In other words, there's no hardwired behavior as to what plants do in this situation or what this species of plant does in this situation. The fact that no plant shows novel behavior in those situations, for me, is evidence. I don't mean conclusive, but evidence for the view that plants probably do not have feelings because they show no novel behaviors.
Winston's mom clarified she was talking about phantom limb syndrome, phantom limb pain. She was wondering, do you study that also?
So I have only as much knowledge about that subject as most people within my field. In other words, it's not an area of research of my own, but I'm familiar with that literature. And there are a few interesting views about that. Ramachandran, Villaneur Ramachandran, I think has written the most interesting stuff on phantom pain. So to give a short answer, I would say I endorse Ramachandran's view. For a long answer, go and read what he says.
Yeah, I really like his work, though, where he used the box with the mirrors in order to relieve the phantom limb syndrome. That was really cool. What does Mark think about the AI singularity and the implications for psychology from In Green?
Well, in the last chapter of my book, I described the project that we're involved in, where we're trying to engineer an artificial consciousness. And a good portion of that chapter concerns the ethics of such a project. I think that we need to be extremely cautious about engineering an artificial consciousness. I've set out in that chapter some of the steps that we're taking, which I think we should all be taking, those of us working in that area.
Gotcha. Zionius asks, does he see a future to applying the Markov blanket to AI for creating artificial consciousness? What is the Markov blanket?
Yeah, so the Markov blanket it's a statistical concept. It has to do with what is a part of the system and what is not part of the system. It demarcates what is system and what is not system. And Markov blankets exist all over the place in nature. Every cell is insulated by a Markov blanket. Every organ is insulated by a Markov blanket, and every organism is insulated by a Markov blanket. It goes to the question I was asked earlier about twins. I do not think that there's a Markov blanket that surrounds the twins. I think each twin is demarcated by its own Markov blanket. I think the concept of Markov blankets is absolutely fundamentally important for a science of consciousness because it is a physical concept. It's a concept that precedes biological self-organizing systems. So it's what I was saying to Tom earlier, that I think that if we're going to have a physicalist account of consciousness, we have to account for it coming into being using concepts that precede the dawn of consciousness. And the Markov blanket is one such concept, because although it's so fundamental to anything, that it's a prerequisite for selfhood, but it is by itself, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient to produce selfhood. So the question then becomes, what other than a Markov blanket do you need to have a sentient self-organizing system?
Gotcha. Samir, thank you for the super chat. Because smoking is foreign, some neurons fire up to let you know you're hungry or need a cigarette, yet you know which to do when the appropriate urge comes. Yes, I agree. I think that's just neuroplasticity in the brain determining which systems give you a dopamine rush, and I don't think that's particularly puzzling. Ratcher asks, when I suffered from depressive episode yesterday, I watched you roasting Jay Dyer on the kill stream, and I instantly felt better. I'm glad you enjoyed that. I did not. That was a miserable debate. Oh, I hated that one. Mr. Creanine, fascinating and brilliant guest, T-Jump Doc, Mark Solms. I'll be in the lookout for your material. Thank you for the compliment. He's giving a shout out. I appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Miracle 19 asks, can I ask if he has read the Quran?
Oh, I'm terribly sorry to say that I have not. But I have had sections read to me. The same applies to the Torah and the Christian Bible. I've had sections read to me, but I'm not familiar in any kind of expert way with any of those three sacred texts.
All right. Charles and Solo, thank you for the super chat. He said, I missed the explanation about the difference between feelings and emotions. Are emotions caused by strong feelings or vice versa?
So, I mean, in my way of using those terms, as I said, it's not, there's no universally agreed definition of these terms. So I'm only speaking about my way of using them. I think that feeling is the broad concept. And then I divide feeling into two types. They're bodily feelings and emotional feelings. I hope that answers it.
Gotcha. All right. I think that's it for the questions. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Well, the book I mentioned, I really encourage you to read it, not only because I would like to sell my book, but because it's really not possible to explain all of these things in the detail they deserve, except in a book. So my book is The Hidden Spring, 3 words, The Hidden Spring. If you don't want to buy anything, I think that the closest open access, there's an open access journal article, which is like a kind of a synopsis in a way of that book. If you just Google my name, Solms, Solms, and the journal Frontiers, it will come up, free open access. And the article is called The Hard Problem of Consciousness and the Free Energy Principle. The Hard Problem of Consciousness and the Free Energy Principle.
Awesome. Thanks again. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me and grilling me. Cheers.
Talk to you later.